And so we always, as I said, we want to start with our policy foundation. So there is a suite of adopted plans that serve as the foundation of this work. City Plan and our Transit Master Plan really talk about how we grow and where we grow as a community, and specifically focused on land use and transportation strategies to achieve that vision. The Housing Strategic Plan outlines clear challenges and strategies to ensure we have healthy, stable housing that everyone can afford. Our Climate Future Plan supports complete neighborhoods, density, and housing options in close proximity to jobs, services, as well as education and other access to other opportunities. But it also talks about and supports multi-unit housing, attached and multi-unit structures, because those support overall lower building emissions, higher degrees of energy efficiency, and we also see lower uses of water in those circumstances. So all of these plans collectively have informed the work and was developed with significant community involvement, and all of these plans were also adopted by City Council. Now, at the onset of the process, we worked with City Council and the community to develop 5 guiding principles. These guiding principles have informed our work every step of the way. It has informed the alternatives that we explored, our analysis of the different inputs provided by community, and used to review final draft language of the code that's in front of you. And I'll talk a little bit more about these in a following slide when we get into some of the detailed changes. So as we go forward and kind of set the stage for what is in front of you, what is in the code, we also wanted to start with what is not in the code so that we're all clear and grounded in what didn't get changed as part of this process. And so what are the types of regulations that will continue to go forward if this code is adopted? So a few examples include review procedures. We talked about review procedures during this process, but determined at the end, really what we wanted to do was really just focus on making them clear and predictable, clear and well organized. We did not make any substantive changes to the review procedures. The same is true for specifics pertaining to non-residential uses. We were focused on housing and housing strategic plan implementation. Historic preservation wasn't something that we changed, so those rules and processes and guidelines still apply. And then other things such as landscaping and occupancy are also components of the land use code that did not change. So to set the context for what has changed, we've prepared this summary. We've updated it based on the changes we made after first reading, and really tried to organize these changes in terms of our guiding principles. So the first one on the list is our guiding principle around increasing overall housing capacity. So just to highlight a few things that are listed in this slide, an example of how this principle was implemented with changes includes allowing more housing units or more density in our higher density residential zone districts and mixed use zone districts. So if you're familiar with LMN or MMN, those were all districts where we focused on increasing density and housing capacity. The second guiding principle is about enabling more affordability. And we helped accomplish this by updating and modifying our definitions of affordability. And providing a wider range and threshold for projects that qualify under that definition. For guiding principle number 3, which is allow for more diverse housing choices, a good example of this improvement is in the allowances that were proposed related to accessory dwelling units. Introducing that type of housing unit into all residential and mixed use zone districts helps achieve housing choices in neighborhoods. And we combined the final 2 guiding principles because they relate so well to one another. And it's really around making the code easy to use and improving the predictability. A few examples of that include consolidating regulations that were repeated in different locations or difficult to find in the code. And then we also introduced a formatting of graphics and the form-based model approach to our code standards so that it's, again, easy to read, easy to understand what could be built in your neighborhood. Now I'll hand it off to Paul.
Thanks, Karen. I'm going to talk a little about the discussion topics from first reading and then go over a couple of context slides to help with council's discussion tonight. So these are the 7 discussion topics that we highlighted for council at first reading. The draft you reviewed 2 weeks ago included all 7 of these items, and council voted to keep 6 of them in the current draft before you tonight. The item you chose to remove was item number 1, meaning that in this second reading draft of the code, duplexes are not allowed in the RL zone. I'll also point out that council kept number 7, which means that while someone cannot build an ADU and then use that as a short-term rental, they could build an ADU, move into it, and rent their main house as a short-term rental in those places where short-term rentals are allowed. On the topic, or one topic that council discussed a lot at first reading was how using housing capacity would be geographically dispersed around the community under the land use code. Earlier in the code drafting process, our consultants did some modeling and determined that under the existing land use code, there's capacity for about 26,000 more residential units to be built in the city. Under the draft code as it exists tonight, we would add capacity for about another 13,000 units, bringing the total units that could be built to about 39,000 new units across the city. So this chart shows a rough projection of where that capacity exists. Most of it's available in our mixed-use zones like LMN and MMN. About a quarter of it is located in commercial zone districts, and we'd only estimate about 6% of the remaining capacity exists in the lower density residential zones like RL, NCL, NCM, and urban estates. So this image shows how these groupings of zone districts are distributed across the city. The pink represents where those commercial zones are located, where about 23% of the capacity would exist. The green shows our mixed-use zones, where 71% of the capacity would be. And the blue is where the residential zones are located, where about 6% of the capacity would be. Another area of discussion was around peer city policies for accessory dwelling units, and we have new information for council on this topic. Since the first reading, we reviewed 33 Front Range jurisdictions and found that 85% of them do allow accessory dwelling units. 70% of the jurisdictions adopted ADU regulations just in the past 3 years. Most allow ADUs as an administrative review, so a staff approval. Most do allow them for short-term rentals, and about 61% of them require owner occupancy of the property. Council also talked about investor and out-of-state ownership of rental units, and we have information from a 2021 investor ownership analysis to provide some context on this topic. This data focuses specifically on detached single-family homes and missing middle housing types, so duplexes, triplexes, townhomes. So it excludes apartment buildings, which are investment properties by nature. The key takeaways here are that about 5% of these types of housing stock in Fort Collins are owned by out-of-state investors. About 90% of our landlords in our community own just one property in addition to their own residence. The number of landlords who own 10 or more housing units make up about 0.2% of the total landlords in our community. So in Fort Collins, rental units that are single-family homes and missing middle housing are mostly owned by small landlords who may only be renting out one additional unit and living in another unit in town. At the first reading, council expressed an interest in having a visual representation of what's in the current code, what was in the repealed code, what's changed to now. And I'm going to give a very high-level overview over these next couple slides, and we're happy to dig into those and revisit any element council wants to take a closer look at. So starting with the RL zone, basically the current code in effect today allows a single detached house. The repealed land development code would have allowed 2 units in most cases, up to 3 dwelling units on a lot if one of them was deed restricted affordable. We heard public comment that led us to remove allowable building types, require more parking, and look again at HOA requirements. And the resulting draft code would now allow only single-family homes and accessory dwelling units, and would put a number of other provisions into place, like requiring a resident manager on ADU properties and prohibiting short-term rental of ADUs. In the NCL zone, which would now be called Old Town A, the existing code today allows detached homes and a carriage house on larger lots, so up to 2 units. The repealed code would have allowed up to 3 units and put a cap of 2,400 square feet on the floor area of a house. We heard similar comments about neighborhood character that led us to increase lot size requirements for multiple unit buildings and to require parking for ADUs. And the resulting draft code would still allow up to 3 units in some cases, but with new lot size requirements that limit exactly where those can go. We would now also limit ADUs without an alley to 15 feet in height, and to build a triplex in this zone, the units would need to either integrate into an existing structure or to provide deed-restricted affordable housing as a part of that. In the NCM zone, which would become Old Town B, the existing code allows up to 4 units on a lot. The repealed code would have allowed 5 units and a 6th if one of those was deed-restricted affordable. We heard comments that led us to increase the lot size requirements for some of the building types that would have more units, and to add requirements for integrating into existing structures. And this resulted in a draft code with larger lot sizes for larger building types, and in order to reach the higher number of units, requirements to integrate into an existing structure or to provide a dedicated affordable unit. And finally, for homeowners associations, the existing code today limits the authority of HOAs to prohibit a number of things like xeriscape and solar panels, but it doesn't have anything about housing types. In the repealed code, the HOAs would have been prohibited from preventing the implementation of any of the housing goals in this code. We heard comment that led us to clarify what exactly HOAs should be allowed to regulate. And the resulting draft code would prohibit HOAs from limiting the number or type of dwelling units or the ability to subdivide a property if it otherwise qualifies. But it would allow HOAs to regulate aesthetics and determine whether ADUs are internal or external to the unit. And so that was a lot of information and a very high-level overview, and we're happy to support Council's discussion about second reading and adoption of these ordinances.
Thank you very much.